There's something almost everyone experiences at some point, but few people have language for. I call it the fear of expansion. Not the fear of failing, but the fear that comes when life starts asking more of you than the identity you've been living inside can comfortably hold. If you listened to last week's episode, you know I ended with these words. Expansion was never asking you to become someone else. It was asking you to stop negotiating with the person you've already outgrown. I've been thinking about that ever since, because if it's true, why is it so hard? Welcome back to your Passion, Purpose, and Personal Brand. I'm Lisa McGuire, Strategic Identity Advisor and creator of the category of Only. If you are someone that has come to recognize that we've already changed, why do we keep introducing ourselves in ways that no longer feel true? Why do we keep making decisions from a version of ourselves we've already outgrown, staying loyal to roles that no longer fit, trying to solve today's questions with yesterday's identity? I don't think it's a weakness, and I don't think it's confusion. I think it's because something has happened so gradually that we rarely notice it while it's occurring. Today, I want to give that experience a name. I call it identity compression. When most people hear the word identity, they think about labels: mother, leader, executive, entrepreneur, consultant, teacher, coach. But identity doesn't start there. Those are roles. Identity runs deeper. It's the way you naturally move through the world. The thread that's been present throughout your life long before you had a resume, a title, a business card, or a LinkedIn profile. You can see it in the problems you're drawn to solve, the conversations that give you energy, the people who naturally seek you out. You can see it in the way you make decisions, the way you build trust, the contribution you make when you're not trying to prove anything. That's identity. The roles are simply where it gets expressed. And here's where it gets interesting. If you stay in one role long enough, especially if you're good at it, the role and the identity start to merge. Not overnight, so gradually you don't even notice. That's where identity compression begins. Think about the people you've admired, the ones who everyone depends on, who always know what to do, the calm voice in the middle of chaos, the one who solves hard problems and quietly carries everyone else. They are the expert, the connector, the visionary, the fixer, the mentor, the leader. Eventually, those aren't just things they do. They become who everyone believes they are, most of all, including themselves. And here's what's fascinating. It doesn't happen because they're pretending. It happens because they're succeeding. And success rewards consistency. Organizations reward predictability. Clients reward expertise. Industries reward stabilization. And families reward dependability. Every time you become known for something, the world invites you to become even more of that thing. Until one expression of who you are slowly becomes the entire definition of who you are. Not because anyone intended it, but because everyone, including you, started organizing life around that version of yourself. I want you to notice something. Identity compression isn't burnout, exhaustion, or even feeling stuck. Those can be consequences of it, but they aren't the cause. It happens when one successful expression of you becomes so rewarded, so practiced, so expected, that every other part of you has less room to breathe. You don't wake up one day and decide to become smaller. You become more specialized, more dependable, more accomplished. You are more respected, you're more needed, until one day you realize everyone knows exactly what to come to you for. But you're no longer sure that's the fullest expression of who you are. One of the biggest misconceptions we carry is believing success naturally leads to freedom. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it creates something else instead. It creates responsibility, expectation, reputation, obligation. People start expecting you to keep showing up as the version of yourself they've always known. And after a while, you start expecting it from yourself too. You stop asking, who am I becoming? And you start asking, how do I keep being the person everyone depends on? Those are very different questions. One leads towards growth, the other toward compression. As I've reflected over the years, I've noticed identity compression tends to follow the same arc. It starts with adaptation, learning how to succeed in a particular environment. That adaptation turns into capability. You become exceptionally good at what you do. Capability earns you a reputation. People start knowing you for that contribution long before the reputation identifies into a role. Somewhere in there, the role quietly becomes identity. And eventually, identity turns into obligation. You don't just know how to perform the role anymore. You feel responsible for continuing to be that person even after you've begun outgrowing it. That's identity compression. Here's what I hope you'll hear today. This isn't about abandoning your career, rejecting success, or starting over. It's about recognizing the difference between the role you've played and the person who's been playing it. If we don't understand that difference, we'll spend years trying to fix our lives when actually what needs attention is our relationship with our identity. I know this because I've lived it. I didn't understand any of it while I was in the middle of it. And I only understood it after I walked away from one of the most meaningful chapters of my life. Looking back now, I can finally see what was happening. And I think my story might help you see your own. But before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's episode, Architect Her. One of the reasons I'm so excited to be part of this movement is that it recognizes something I've been talking about throughout this entire series. So many accomplished women don't need another leadership strategy, another certification, or permission to become someone else. They need space to reconnect with the fullness of who they've already become. Architect Her was created for women who know their greatest contribution is still ahead of them. Not because they need to prove themselves, but because they're finally ready to lead from a deeper place of alignment. If today's conversation is resonating with you, take a look at Architect Her down in the show notes. Now, let me tell you about the chapter of my own life that eventually led me to understand what I now call identity compression. So let me take you back, long before I became a strategic identity advisor, the creator of the category of Only, before the podcast. I had the privilege of helping build an independent school from the ground up. I volunteered for an entire year before the school ever opened its doors, when there were no students, no classrooms, no traditions, or no alumni. Just a handful of people with a vision that education could be something more than academics. We believed that we were building a community that would shape lives, and I believed in that vision with my whole heart. When the school officially opened, I came on staff, and over the next 18 years, my role kept evolving. If you were to ask me today what my job title was, I'm not sure I could give you a simple answer, because I wore a lot of hats. I met with every family whose child attended the school. I worked with students, partnered with parents, collaborated with faculty, and worked alongside leadership. Some days I was solving strategic problems. Others I was navigating operational issues. Sometimes I was coaching, sometimes counseling, and sometimes simply listening. I lived in the space between vision and execution, between what we dreamed the school could become and what it took every day to make that dream real. And I loved it, not because it was easy, but because it mattered, And when something matters that deeply, you don't just give it your time. You give it pieces of yourself. One of the greatest gifts of being there from the very beginning was watching an entire community grow up. There were babies born during that first year whom I first met carried on their mother's hip. Years later, I got to watch those same young men and women walk across the stage to receive their high school diploma. I had a front row seat to their milestones, their struggles, their celebrations, and their growth. I watched families become lifelong friends, teachers and coaches become mentors, and a vision become a thriving community. Because I had been there before the doors opened, I carried something that couldn't be easily replaced: institutional memory. Not just what happened, but why it happened. I remembered the original conversations, the first hopes, the early decisions, the moments that shaped the culture before anyone ever knew whether the school would succeed. That kind of history doesn't live in a handbook. It lives in people, in relationships, in shared experience, and in stories. Looking back now, I can also see something I could not recognize at the time. Every year, the work asked a little bit more of me. And every year, because I cared so deeply, I willingly gave a little more. People trusted me and depended on me. If there was a problem to solve, I leaned in. If a family needed support, I wanted to help. If there was uncertainty, I wanted to bring clarity. At the time, I would have called it commitment, responsibility, or leadership. And all of those things were true. But something else was happening beneath the surface without realizing it. More and more of my identity became intertwined with the role I played. Not because anyone asked me to or expected me to, but because I loved the mission and I believed in the people, and serving that community had become one of the deepest expressions of who I was. Then, after 18 years, life interrupted the story. There was a reorganization. I wasn't leaving because I had decided it was time. The decision was made for me. In an instant, everything that had organized my days, and if I'm honest, much of how I understood myself changed. I wasn't simply walking away from a job. I was walking away from students whose lives I had watched unfold, parents I'd walked beside, colleagues who had become dear friends, and an entire independent school community where I wasn't just known. I belonged in a way no other person did. I'd become the mother role to so many people who depended on me. For nearly 2 decades, that community had been the place where my contribution made sense, where people knew me, trusted me, needed me, and suddenly it wasn't. I remember waking up in the weeks that followed and realizing something I never expected. I knew exactly what I had done. I could tell you every responsibility I carried, every challenge we'd overcome, every success we'd celebrated. But if someone had asked me, "Who are you now?" I wasn't sure I knew how to answer. At first, I thought I was grieving a career. Years later, I realized I was grieving something much deeper. I wasn't grieving the work. I was grieving the identity that the work had been holding for me. That realization changed everything, because for the first time, I could finally see the difference between who I had always been and the role which had been expressing it. I hadn't lost myself. I had lost access to myself. And once I understood that, I began seeing the same pattern in the lives of people who came to me for help. If my story feels familiar, you're not alone. Over the years, I've come to believe identity compression is one of the most common experiences among successful people. And not because they did anything wrong. Success has a way of rewarding one expression of who we are, and eventually the world starts relating to us through that one expression. After a while, so do we. That's why so many of the people who come to me initially describe their situation in practical terms. They tell me they need to rewrite their website, or they think they need to clarify their positioning, figure out their next career move, or build a better business strategy. And those things may genuinely need attention. But after a few conversations, I often realize we're talking about something deeper. They're not really asking, what should I do next? They're asking, who am I now? Most of them don't realize that's the question they're carrying. They just know something doesn't fit anymore. I think of a woman I worked with recently who had spent decades inside one extraordinary organization. She'd become deeply respected. People trusted her judgment, and she knew how to navigate complexity, bring people together, and solve problems that others could not. When she left, she thought she had a messaging problem. She made lists of possible careers, consulting, coaching, going back into corporate, a leadership role, even becoming a fractional executive. Every option made sense, and yet none of them felt completely true. As we talked, I noticed something interesting. Every time she described a job, her energy flattened. But every time she described the moment she loved most over her career, her face changed. She came alive. It was never about the title or the industry. The thread running through her life had always been the same: helping people find clarity, connecting them, developing others, creating trust, translating complexity into something people could move forward with. Those weren't skills she'd picked up at one company. They were expressions of who she'd always been. The organization hadn't created those gifts. It had simply become the place where they were expressed. Now that's an important distinction, because when she left, she assumed she'd lost what made her valuable. She had not. She lost the environment that had been reflecting it back to her. I see that over and over again. Sometimes it happens after a layoff, sometimes after selling a business or retiring, sometimes it's after the kids leave home, or even a health crisis. And sometimes after extraordinary success, after building the very company everyone else admires. The circumstances differ, but the experience is remarkably similar. People tell me, I don't feel like myself anymore. I always want to ask them a different question. What if yourself isn't gone? What if the role simply became so loud that you lost access to the rest of you? I think this is why so many high-achieving people feel exhausted even when they are successful. They're not only carrying the work, they're carrying the expectation of continuing to be the version of themselves everyone has come to rely on. And that's a heavy thing to carry, especially if you've quietly begun changing. Here's something I've noticed about identity compression. It leaves a few unmistakable fingerprints. Maybe you introduce yourself with an old title because you don't know what else to say. Maybe you keep trying to return to a kind of work that no longer energizes you, simply because it's what people know you for. You feel guilty when opportunities no longer excite you, and you keep searching for the perfect strategy when what you're really missing is permission to acknowledge that you've changed. Success suddenly feels strangely empty, and you've become remarkably competent while somehow growing more disconnected from yourself. If any of that sounds familiar, I don't think you're broken, and I don't think you're confused. I think what's happened is that you may be compressed. Here's the most important thing I've learned. The first breakthrough isn't clarity. It's relief. Relief that there's a reason why this feels so disorienting. Relief that you're not failing and that you're not simply ungrateful for everything you've accomplished. Relief that the discomfort isn't asking you to become someone different. It's inviting you to become completely more of yourself. When people experience that realization, I often watch something remarkable happen. Their shoulders relax. Their breathing changes. They stop trying to solve themselves because for the very first time, they realize they don't need fixing. They need remembering. That's the moment everything begins to shift. Once I began seeing that pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. I saw it in founders who'd built remarkable companies, but wondered who they were outside of the business. In executives whose careers had been defined by extraordinary success, who no longer recognized the person in the mirror. And in professionals who'd become experts in their field, but couldn't explain why work that once energized them suddenly felt heavy. I even saw it in entrepreneurs who left corporate because they wanted freedom, only to build businesses that compressed them all over again. Different circumstances, the same pattern. Over time, I realized something that changed the way that I worked with people. Most don't need better strategy first. They need better access to themselves. Strategy does not create identity. It expresses it. Think about how often we do the opposite. When something feels off, we immediately start searching outside of ourselves. Maybe I need another certification. Maybe I need a new website, a better niche, another coach, or a complete reinvention. None of those questions are necessarily wrong. They're simply premature because strategy can only amplify what's already underneath it. If the identity underneath is compressed, strategy just becomes a more sophisticated way of expressing that compression. That's why someone can execute every business strategy perfectly and still feel strangely disconnected. Why someone can build an admired career while privately wondering why it no longer feels like them. Why someone can grow more successful and harder to recognize in their own life at the same time. The problem was never the strategy. It's that the strategy got built around an identity that no longer reflects who they've become. That's why I often say identity comes before strategy. Strategy matters. It absolutely does. But it answers a different question. Strategy answers how. Identity answers who. And if you skip that second question, the first one rarely takes you where you actually want to go. And this is where Category of Only was born. Not because I set out to create another positioning framework. There are already plenty of those. It came from a different question. What's the thread that has always been true about someone, regardless of the role, the title, the company, or the chapter of life they're in? I've discovered something remarkable. Long before people know what they should do next, there's usually a pattern already there. It shows up in childhood, in relationships, in the problems they naturally solve, in the people who are drawn to them, in the moments where they feel most alive. It's been there all along. Most people just haven't had anyone to help them recognize it. Your category of only isn't something you manufacture. It isn't a clever positioning statement, and it isn't branding or messaging. It's the unmistakable pattern of contribution that's been expressing itself throughout your life, long before you had words for it. When people recognize that pattern, the pressure comes off. They stop asking, who should I become? And start asking, how do I give fuller expression to who I've always been? One of those questions is driven by proving. The other is driven by remembering. There's another realization that has stayed with me. Identity compression doesn't happen because we're weak. It often happens because we're faithful. Faithful to the people we serve, the mission we believe in, the role we've been entrusted with. And the promises we've made, those aren't flaws. They're beautiful qualities. The challenge comes when our faithfulness to a role quietly grows larger than our faithfulness to our own becoming. At some point, life begins inviting us to expand again, not because the role was wrong, but because it was never meant to contain the whole of who we are. I look back now with tremendous gratitude for those 18 years. I wouldn't trade them. They shaped me, they taught me, they introduced me to extraordinary people, and gave me experiences that still influence my work today. But they were never meant to become the definition of me. They were one chapter, not the whole story. Maybe that's where you find yourself today. Maybe nothing is outwardly wrong. Your career looks successful, your business is growing, people respect you, and from the outside, your life makes perfect sense. But inside, something has grown quieter, maybe louder, a question that refuses to go away, a sense that the way you've always introduced yourself is no longer telling the whole truth. If that's you, I hope you'll hear this. You don't need permission to become someone else. You need permission to stop reducing yourself to one successful version of who you've always already been. You haven't lost yourself. You've simply lost access to parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for room to breathe again. And once you begin reconnecting those parts, something remarkable happens. The next chapter doesn't feel like reinvention. It feels like recognition, like coming home to someone you knew all along. Next week, we're going to take this conversation one step further because recognizing identity compression is incredibly liberating, but recognition doesn't automatically create freedom. Even after we recognize what's happening, something still pulls us back. There are old reactions, old patterns, old emotional responses that seem to appear before we've even had time to think. Many of us call those triggers. But what if our triggers aren't interruptions? What if they're invitations, showing us exactly where the compressed identity still believes it has to protect us? I'm looking forward to exploring that with my friend Dr. Ursula Lentini, because understanding our triggers may be one of the fastest ways to discover where we're still living from an identity we've already outgrown. Until then, pay attention this week. Notice the moments when you instinctively introduce yourself through what you've done instead of who you've become. Notice the roles where you feel responsible for maintaining and the expectations you've placed on yourself that no longer fit. Do it not with judgment, but with curiosity. But because awareness is where every meaningful transformation begins. Thank you for spending this time with me today. And remember, your category of only isn't about becoming more impressive. It's about becoming more completely yourself. I'll see you here next time.